There's something deeply troubling about how the official investigation into the Greg Biffle citation crash has been conducted. Not troubling because investigators aren't doing their jobs, they absolutely are. Not troubling because evidence is being destroyed or hidden, it's not. What's troubling is what's being overlooked in the public narrative, what's being downplayed or ignored in official briefings, and specifically what critical audio evidence exists that the NTSB has chosen not to acknowledge or discuss publicly, despite its obvious relevance to understanding what happened. Today, we're going to examine audio evidence that may have been overlooked or at minimum underemphasized by the official investigation. We're going to analyze why this evidence matters critically to understanding the accident sequence. And we're going to ask uncomfortable questions about why the NTSB appears reluctant to discuss this evidence even though it directly illuminates the crew's decision-making and actions in those final minutes. Let's start with what the NTSB has officially acknowledged in their public briefings. Spokesperson Michael Graham, in his first press conference shortly after the accident, was asked directly whether the crew had declared an emergency. His response was carefully worded. He stated that they were not aware of an emergency declaration from the crew. Not that there wasn't one, but that they weren't aware of one. That's a very specific, very careful choice of words that suggests either incomplete information at that time or deliberate avoidance of confirming something they knew but weren't ready to discuss. In the second briefing, Graham clarified slightly. He acknowledged that there was a text message sent by someone aboard the aircraft indicating they were making an emergency landing. This was important confirmation that at least one person on that aircraft recognized the situation as an emergency and communicated it. But notice what Graham didn't say in that second briefing. He didn't mention audio. He didn't discuss radio communications from the aircraft. He didn't acknowledge voice transmissions. In fact, in his entire second briefing, he did not use the word audio even once, despite having mentioned audio recordings plural in the first briefing. This conspicuous omission is significant. The NTSB knows the aircraft had a cockpit voice recorder. They recovered it. They've listened to it. They know exactly what was said in that cockpit, by whom, and when. They also know that the aircraft was making radio transmissions during the emergency because those transmissions were heard by multiple people on the ground. Yet in their public communications, they've been remarkably reluctant to discuss or even acknowledge the content of those transmissions. Now let's talk about the audio evidence that exists outside the official investigation's control. Evidence that cannot be ignored or downplayed because it was captured independently by witnesses. At Statesville Regional Airport, there's an FBO facility that monitors the common traffic advisory frequency on a speaker system. This is standard practice at non-towered airports. On the morning of the accident, multiple people were in that FBO. The speaker was on, and they heard 5 separate radio transmissions from the Biffle aircraft during the emergency sequence. 5 transmissions. 5 separate communications where someone aboard that aircraft was reporting their position, their status, their intentions. That's not a crew that was incapacitated or overwhelmed. That's a crew actively managing an emergency, following procedures for position reporting at a non-towered airport, trying to communicate with anyone who might be listening. And critically, one of those 5 transmissions was recorded by a witness on their phone. Let me play that audio for you now. Took off runway 10. We've got an issue here. We're getting everything going. We're getting our gear down. That audio, those words spoken by what multiple witnesses identify as Jack Dutton's voice, is critical evidence. And yet the NTSB has not publicly acknowledged this audio in their briefings. They haven't discussed it. They haven't analyzed it publicly. They haven't used it to help the public understand what the crew was dealing with or what decisions they were making. Why not? Why would critical audio evidence that directly shows the crew was communicating and making decisions, be overlooked or ignored in the public narrative? Let me be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not suggesting the NTSB is covering anything up. I'm not claiming they're hiding evidence or conducting a sham investigation. What I'm suggesting is that they're being extremely cautious, perhaps overly cautious, about what they discuss publicly, to the point where critical evidence that could help the aviation community understand this accident and learn from it is not being shared or acknowledged. And that caution, while understandable from a legal and procedural standpoint, may actually be counterproductive from a safety standpoint. Because if pilots don't understand what happened, if they don't have access to the evidence that shows what decisions were made and what the consequences were, how can they learn from this tragedy? How can they avoid making the same mistakes? Let's analyze what this audio evidence reveals and why it's so critical to understanding the accident. First, the voice. According to witnesses who heard all 5 transmissions, this is Jack Dutton speaking, not Dennis Dutton, the experienced airline captain, not Greg Biffle, the aircraft owner. Jack, the 21-year-old college student. This immediately tells us about crew configuration and roles. If Jack is making radio calls, he's functioning as a crew member. He's in a pilot seat, almost certainly the right seat handling communications. And this raises the question that the NTSB has not addressed publicly. Was Jack qualified to serve in that role? According to publicly available FAA records, Jack held a private pilot certificate for a single-engine aircraft with an instrument rating, but no multi-engine rating. Under Part 91 regulations, a second-in-command doesn't need a type rating, but there are still familiarization requirements. Did Jack meet them? Was he legally qualified to be acting as crew? The NTSB knows the answer to this question from reviewing Jack's records and the flight's regulatory status, but they haven't discussed it publicly. This matters not for assigning blame. Jack is a victim here, not a perpetrator, but for understanding the operational context. If Dennis Dutton was effectively flying alone because his son, while present in the right seat, didn't have the experience or qualifications to provide effective crew assistance, that's a critical factor in understanding how workload and decision-making unfolded. Second, the content. We've got an issue here. Not a specific emergency declaration, not we've lost an engine or we have an engine fire, just an issue. This vague language suggests either incomplete diagnosis at the time of the transmission or inexperience in how to properly communicate emergencies. Experienced pilots are trained to be specific in emergency communications. State the problem clearly. The vagueness here is telling. We're getting everything going. What does this mean? The most reasonable interpretation is that they're working through emergency procedures, running checklists, managing the situation. But again, it's vague, non-standard phraseology. It's the kind of thing someone might say if they're doing their best but aren't deeply experienced in emergency communications. And then the critical piece, well, we're getting our gear down. They are extending landing gear. And the context, the fact that this is being announced as part of a position report, while they're clearly still maneuvering and not yet on final approach, indicates this is early configuration. They're putting the gear down before they're certain they can make the runway, probably because they feel time pressure to get configured for landing as quickly as possible. And as we've discussed extensively in previous analysis, early gear extension in a citation operating on one engine at high weight is potentially fatal. The gear creates enormous drag that the single remaining engine cannot overcome. Once the gear is down, the aircraft cannot maintain altitude. It will descend at a rate determined by physics, and the only question is whether sufficient altitude remains to reach the runway. They didn't have sufficient altitude. They impacted 1,800 feet short. And this audio evidence, this announcement, we're getting our gear down, may document the exact moment when their fate was sealed, when the decision was made that would make recovery impossible. Now, why hasn't the NTSB discussed this audio in their public briefings? There are several possible explanations, none of them entirely satisfactory. One possibility is that they don't consider radio transmissions to be as reliable or important as the cockpit voice recorder. The CVR gives them everything that was said in the cockpit with perfect fidelity. Radio transmissions are just external communications, not the full picture of crew coordination and decision-making. But that logic doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Radio transmissions show what the crew chose to communicate externally. They show how the crew was presenting their situation to others. They show decision points like, we're getting our gear down. That's valuable evidence that complements rather than duplicates the CVR. Another possibility is concern about chain of custody and authentication. The NTSB didn't make this recording. A private citizen did. They can't verify its authenticity in the same way they can verify evidence they collected themselves. They might be reluctant to discuss or rely on evidence they didn't directly obtain. But again, this doesn't fully explain the omission. Multiple witnesses heard the transmissions. The audio quality is consistent with VHF radio communications recorded from a speaker. Technical analysis supports its authenticity, and the NTSB could easily address the authentication question by comparing this audio to what they have on the CVR. If the CVR shows Jack making the same transmission at the same time, that confirms authenticity, yet they haven't done this publicly. A third possibility, and this is the one I find most concerning, is that the NTSB is being extremely cautious about discussing anything that might suggest crew error or poor decision-making before the investigation is complete. They don't want to appear to be assigning blame prematurely. They don't want families to feel like their loved ones are being criticized, so they're staying silent about evidence that might suggest decisions that contributed to the accident. But that caution, while well-intentioned, may be doing a disservice to aviation safety. Because pilots need to know about this, they need to hear this audio, they need to understand that a crew facing an engine failure shortly after takeoff made the decision to extend landing gear early, and that decision contributed to them not making the runway. That's a critical lesson that could save lives in future similar emergencies. Let's also talk about what we don't hear in this audio because the NTSB has also overlooked discussing the significance of what's absent. There's no audible alarm in the background of this transmission, no master warning tone, no stall warning, no terrain warning, no fire bell. The audio is relatively clean, just Jack's voice and minimal background noise. This tells us that at the moment of this transmission, none of those alarm conditions existed. They weren't stalling, they weren't getting terrain warnings. Fire warnings weren't sounding, at least not continuously. This suggests the situation, while serious, was not yet desperate. The aircraft was under control, they were managing an emergency, but not in immediate extremis. And that makes the eventual outcome even more significant. This wasn't an uncontrollable situation. This wasn't an aircraft falling out of the sky with alarms blaring and the crew helpless. This was a crew managing an emergency, making decisions following what they thought was the appropriate course of action, but making choices that incrementally narrowed their margins until recovery became impossible. The NTSB knows all of this. They have the CVR. They have the flight data recorder if this aircraft was equipped with one, and if not, they have radar and ADS-B tracking data. They have the wreckage examination results. They have interviewed witnesses. They have analyzed the engines. They know exactly what happened in what sequence and why, but they're not sharing that knowledge publicly, at least not yet, and they're specifically not discussing or acknowledging this audio evidence. And here's why that's problematic. In the absence of official information, unofficial sources fill the void. Independent analysts like Dan Greider, the citation pilot and instructor, who has extensively analyzed this accident, obtain evidence like this audio and share it publicly. They provide analysis and interpretation. They reach conclusions. And some of those conclusions may be correct and valuable for safety, while others may be speculative or incomplete. But the aviation community and the public are left trying to evaluate these unofficial analyses without the benefit of official information to compare against. If the NTSB would acknowledge and discuss evidence like this audio, would confirm or correct the interpretations being offered, we'd all have a clearer understanding. Instead, there's a vacuum where official silence meets unofficial analysis, and the result is confusion and uncertainty about what really happened. Let me give you a specific example of how this audio evidence matters and how NTSB discussion of it could improve safety. One of the most controversial questions about this accident is whether the decision to turn back immediately rather than climbing to altitude was appropriate. That decision is a judgment call that depends on many factors, including altitude, weather, aircraft performance, crew experience, and the nature of the emergency. This audio provides evidence about that decision-making process. And the fact that Jack is announcing we're getting our gear down while still making position reports and clearly still maneuvering suggests they committed to the immediate return and began configuring before they had definitively assured they could make the runway. That's a data point, that's evidence. The NTSB could use this evidence to discuss, in general terms, the dangers of early configuration in single-engine operations. They could use it to reinforce training standards without specifically criticizing this crew. But by not acknowledging this audio, by not discussing what it shows, they're missing an opportunity to provide clear guidance to the pilot community. And that's a safety issue, because the next crew that faces an engine failure shortly after takeoff in a citation needs to know that configuring early, before you're certain you can make the runway, can be fatal. This audio shows exactly that, but the NTSB isn't using it for that purpose. There's also the question of who should have been making those radio calls. In a properly functioning multi-crew operation, typically the pilot not flying handles radios, while the pilot flying focuses on controlling the aircraft. If Jack was making radio calls, that suggests Dennis was flying, which makes sense given Dennis's experience and qualifications. But it also raises the question of what else Jack was or wasn't doing. Was he running checklists? Was he monitoring instruments? Was he helping with decision making? Or was he simply reading off position reports without being able to contribute meaningfully to managing the emergency? The NTSB knows the answers from the CVR. They can hear the crew coordination or lack thereof, but they haven't discussed it publicly, so we're left speculating about whether crew resource management issues contributed to the accident. Now, let me address a counterargument. Some might say the NTSB is right to be cautious, that discussing evidence before the investigation is complete risks jumping to wrong conclusions. That releasing or discussing audio of people who died is disrespectful to their memory and their families. That the proper course is to wait for the full investigation, analyze everything thoroughly, and then release comprehensive findings. I understand that perspective, I respect it, but I disagree with it in this case for several reasons. First, this audio already exists in the public domain. It's been shared online. It's been analyzed by independent experts. The NTSB's silence doesn't make it go away. It just means the NTSB isn't providing official context or correction to interpretations that may be wrong. Second, the safety value of this evidence is immediate and time-sensitive. Right now, today, there are citation pilots flying who might face similar emergencies. If they understand the lessons from this accident, they might make better decisions and survive. Waiting 18 months for the final report means 18 months during which pilots don't have the benefit of these lessons. That's a safety cost. Third, acknowledging and discussing evidence doesn't require assigning blame or criticizing the deceased. The NTSB could say, "We have audio of transmissions from the aircraft. Those transmissions indicate the crew was extending landing gear while still maneuvering to return to the airport. Early configuration in single-engine operations can significantly reduce performance margins. Pilots should carefully consider configuration timing in emergency situations." That statement respects the crew, provides valuable safety information, and acknowledges the evidence without prejudging the investigation's conclusions. Let's also talk about what this audio doesn't tell us, because it's important to be clear about the limitations. This audio doesn't tell us why the engine failed. The baggage door and foreign object ingestion theory is still the most likely based on physical evidence, but this audio doesn't address that. This audio doesn't tell us what altitude they were at when it was transmitted. It doesn't tell us what was happening in the rest of the cockpit, what Dennis was doing, what Greg Biffle was experiencing. It doesn't tell us what was said in the other 4 transmissions that weren't recorded. So this audio is one piece of a larger puzzle, a valuable piece, a revealing piece, but not the complete picture. And that's exactly why NTSB discussion and contextualization of it would be valuable. They have the complete picture. They can tell us how this audio fits into the larger sequence of events, but they're choosing not to. And that choice may be denying the aviation community valuable safety lessons. As we wait for the preliminary report, which should be released soon, and eventually for the final report, which will take many months, we should remember that evidence exists beyond what the NTSB chooses to discuss publicly. This audio recording exists. Witnesses exist. Flight tracking data exists. Post-crash photographs exist. All of this evidence tells a story, and that story is emerging even in the absence of official acknowledgement. The question is whether the official investigation will eventually align with what this evidence suggests, or whether there will be discrepancies that need to be explained. When the preliminary report is released, we'll be able to compare what it says about crew actions, about configuration timing, about communications, with what this audio shows. If there are contradictions, we'll need to understand why. If there's alignment, it will validate the importance of this evidence. What's clear is that this audio recording is not something that should be overlooked. It's critical evidence that illuminates decision-making, crew actions, and the sequence of events. Whether the NTSB has truly overlooked it or simply chosen not to discuss it publicly, the result is the same: a gap in the public understanding that independent analysts are trying to fill with varying degrees of accuracy and completeness. Aviation safety depends on learning from accidents. Learning requires access to evidence and honest discussion of what that evidence shows. This audio recording should be part of that discussion, acknowledged by the NTSB, analyzed in the context of all available evidence, and used to extract lessons that can prevent future tragedies. If you found this analysis valuable and want to stay informed as more information emerges from the official investigation, please subscribe to this channel. Share this video with others in the aviation community who need to understand what happened and why. And remember, every piece of evidence, every audio recording, every data point brings us closer to the truth and to the lessons that can save lives. Thank you for watching.